There's no denying that The Muppet Show was a runaway success. It's estimated that it had an international audience of over 200 million in over 100 countries, creating a universal cultural moment that cemented their place in the zeitgeist and in our collective childhood memories. But The Muppet Show also captured a moment in time, an era of chaotic comedies that harkened back to the days of slapstick and vaudeville, a desperately needed antidote to Watergate and the Vietnam War. But as the freewheeling 70s became the capitalist 80s, the Muppets fell out of favor. The TV show ended in 1981, and their third feature, The Muppets Take Manhattan, made only a little over $25 million. Jim Henson, now largely absent from The Muppets, was focused on his pet projects, The Dark Crystal and The Labyrinth. Both would be financial failures. And despite a good run with children's shows like The Muppet Babies and Fraggle Rock, audience appetite for more Muppets was low. Disney was already sniffing around, and following the death of Jim Henson in 1990, they would step in and co-produce one final success with The Muppet Christmas Carol. Emboldened and flush with Disney cash, they tripled the budget for their next feature, Muppet Treasure Island, and promptly fell on their face. The Muppets have failed to find their footing since. From reinvention to a return to form, the next 30 years of the Muppets have been a calamity of mismanagement, near misses, and outright failures. As we look back at what's become of these once beloved characters, we need to ask ourselves, should the Muppets retire? The failure of Treasure Island stung, and concerned that the last two films had infantilized the Muppets, Treasure Island writer Kirk Thatcher led the charge for an edgier, more adult show with Muppets Tonight. His vision was, in many ways, truer to the original Muppet Show. After all, the original pilot was titled Sex and Violence. Sure, they were kid-friendly, but not geared exclusively to kids. Up against the likes of South Park and Ren and Stimpy, it seemed a sound mindset, but one that would fail them then and time again. The time slot for Muppets Tonight shifted 3 times as ABC fished for viewers, with the second season playing out entirely on the Disney Channel. Even with some decent-sized guest stars who likely agreed to be a part of it before seeing the final product, it failed to draw a crowd. To rub salt in the wound, Muppets Tonight would win an Emmy for Best Children's Programming, cementing their place as purely kiddie fare. The back and forth between updating for a modern audience or staying in the shallow end of the pool would haunt every production onwards. That internal tug-of-war at the Henson Company would produce some Frankenstein productions, and nowhere more evident than in 1999's Muppets from Space. In many ways, Muppets from Space derailed the franchise, and it would be 13 years before they saw the big screen again. Behind-the-scenes wrangling over story and direction are evident on the screen, with large patches of the script hastily rewritten and a complete U-turn on the ending. Co-writer Joseph Mazzarino called it a miserable experience, and audiences and critics agreed. On a budget of $24 million, it only took in $22 million and had even hardcore fans like Roger Ebert suggesting that the Muppets had become the one thing that they'd tried so hard to avoid: dated. The movie's performance also derailed the deal the Henson Company had with Sony for 15 features over 5 years with a budget north of $200 million. Suddenly cash-strapped, they finally agreed to be sold off to the German media company EM for $680 million. A few years later, though, EM had major fiscal problems, and in 2003, the Henson family bought back their company for a fraction of what EM paid. Exhausted, and with no Muppet projects on the horizon, the company hiked up their pants and finally sold to Disney. As would soon become the pattern for Disney, they meddled in the development, rushed something to the screens, and fans were served something half-baked. The Muppets' Wizard of Oz tanked. Despite premiering on commercial TV, it ranked as the 42nd most-watched television program of the week. Audiences hated it, and the critics who watched it, all 10 of them, lashed it with a meager 30% on Rotten Tomatoes. Kirk Thatcher's more adult humor may have steered Muppets Tonight into a sandbar, but The Wizard of Oz wrecked that ship and set it on fire. References to Girls Gone Wild and a Quentin Tarantino cameo didn't fly with parents, and replacing Dorothy's wish to go home with her desire instead for Oz to make her a famous star was shallow and off-brand for both The Wizard of Oz and the Muppets. Mostly, though, it just felt small and cheap. The magic was gone. Interest had dwindled, and Disney's $75 million golden goose was now an albatross. It took 14 years for Disney to wrangle control of the Muppets, and they blew it with their first swing. It didn't help that Frank Oz was telling anyone who would listen that Disney's attempt to buy the Muppets is probably what killed Jim Henson. Disney's legendary frugality saw many original performers part ways with the company, and Disney CEO Bob Iger, who was never a fan, shuffled oversight of the group around the company, never really finding them a home. No one knew what to do with them. The Muppets were out in the cold. Jason Segel told so many people that he was writing a Muppet movie that eventually Disney was forced to let him. The self-described superfan wanted to pay homage to the Muppets' roots, and he undeniably achieved that, much in the same way J.J. Abrams paid homage to A New Hope with The Force Awakens, by treading familiar ground. Groundbreaking. In order to save Muppet Theater, Kermit would have to get the band together and put on a show. Critics and audiences took the nostalgia bait, and the film reeled in $165 million from a $45 million budget, helped in no small part by Segal's whistle-stop promotion tour. Segal's intent from the start was to put the Muppets back in the spotlight, and mission accomplished, he declined the offer for a sequel. The movie was only a modest success, a fitting swan song that returned Disney's $75 million advance back into its coffers. But Disney wasn't going to short its investment now that it was finally showing returns. To keep the spotlight on the Muppets while they waited on the sequel, they pumped out the Lady Gaga and the Muppets Holiday Spectacular, a vehicle to debut her new album with so few Muppets that when they did show up, they looked like product placement, and the Jim Henson Creature Workshop Challenge, a 6-episode puppet version of Project Runway that was canceled after the first season. These were both filler, though, killing time before the next new movie. While Segal's film was laden with so much saccharin that it put viewers into a diabetic coma, Muppets Most Wanted asked the question, how funny would it be if Kermit was sent to a Russian gulag? If the box office was anything to go by, the answer was, not very. Following what they presumably thought was a successful formula with The Great Muppet Caper, Muppets Most Wanted was cumbersome, soulless, and bloated. The film opens the same way as every Muppet movie does, including the one before it, by separating Kermit from Piggy so that they reunite in the third act. This is literally the arc of every movie. Muppets go their separate ways, shenanigans ensue, Muppets reunite. Everything else, especially the celebrity cameos, are just scenery. A lot of reasons were laid out for its failure, not one of which was Disney and the Henson Company needing to take a good, long, hard look at themselves. No, instead it was the lack of Segal, a surprisingly strong showing from Mr. Peabody and Sherman, not releasing it around Thanksgiving. Plus, and I'm not making this up, the Russian invasion of Crimea. Not a great time for gulag gags. In 2015, the Muppets launched what could be argued was their first sitcom. Simply titled The Muppets, the series was a parody of other mockumentary-style shows, such as Parks and Recreation, Modern Family, and The Office. The show revolves around the backstage antics of a late-night talk show hosted by Miss Piggy, and credit where credit's due, it's not awful. It's not funny either, and the more adult approach to its humor, including references to sexuality, drugs, and alcohol, was enough for the American Family Association's Karens on Demand, also known as 1 Million Moms, to organize a boycott before the show had even aired. They needn't have bothered. ABC canceled the series after just 16 episodes when it failed to turn around ratings, which had started with a respectable 9 million and slowly petered out to less than 3. A far cry from the halcyon Muppet Show days of a worldwide 200 million. In many ways, it's this series that exemplifies the Muppet dilemma. Their old style of humor isn't funny anymore, but audiences don't like it when they modernize it. They want the Muppets of old, but they don't want to watch it. Trying to meet the audience halfway, Ben Henson produced a new crop of characters for the R-rated Happy Land Murders just 2 years later, which bombed so spectacularly that they were sued by the owners of Sesame Street for smearing their reputation. In 2019, Disney cranked out a reboot of Muppet Babies for Disney Junior, which coincidentally would also be sued, this time by Jeff Scott, the guy who developed the original. But with their streaming service on the horizon, they needed new content, and they needed it fast. The series, being written for the last year and a half by Josh Gad, set after the events of Muppets Take Manhattan, was shelved due to creative differences. So the Muppet Studios hastily cobbled together what would become Muppets Now, a 6-part and purportedly improvised series of disjointed shorts and one-joke sketches. It has a rating of 69% on Rotten Tomatoes, and I'm calling bull. It reportedly only took 6 days to shoot all 6 episodes, and it shows. The sketches are sketchy, the cameos are wasted, and the series is a microcosm of everything that's wrong with the Muppets, making the same jokes they made 40 years ago and expecting the same response. After all this time, how much comedy is there still to mine out of Miss Piggy's vanity or Fozzie's insecurities? The Muppets are at their best when someone wrote a genuinely funny sketch, then inserted a Muppet into it. The writers were leaning too heavily into the idea that the Muppets are funny simply because they're Muppets. That ship has sailed. A half-decent attempt to rectify that was made in 2021 with the short feature Muppets Haunted Mansion, a tie-in with the Disney theme park attraction. It focused almost exclusively on Gonzo and Peppy and finally gave the Muppets their long-sought Halloween special. From this moderate success came the Muppets Mayhem. Adam F. Goldberg, who also wrote the screenplay for the failed Muppets Wizard of Oz, was somehow given another shot, and the results were not great. There's always been a great debate among the Muppet creators over the value of the human centerpiece, with some arguing that the human should be the anchor, while others argue they should play second fiddle to the Muppets. Either way, casting is key. So for Muppets Mayhem, they cast... I'm part of every... Oh God, really? Lily Singh?
Sometimes I think you want to fail.
Well, that aside, the show groans under the weight of trying to elevate 6 minor Muppets, 3 of which are mostly nonverbal, to create over 4 hours of plot. One critic rather aptly described it as a show for everyone and sort of no one, really. The audience has moved on. You have to wonder, at what point are the diminishing returns enough to call it quits? Even the House of Mouse knew that milking Mickey wasn't a viable long-term strategy. The Muppets haven't been beloved for 40 years. They were beloved 40 years ago. No one's buying what they're selling. But you would assume that it was selling products that was keeping the franchise alive. But merchandising has long since fallen off, accounting for little more than a shelf in Disney stores and even less on their balance sheets. The creator of Muppets Mayhem referred to them as an IP in the vein of Star Wars and Marvel, which is true in so much as Disney got a hold of it and ruined it for everyone.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
But it would be unfair to lay the blame entirely at their feet. Jim Henson's kids still serve as chairman and CEO, desperately trying to keep their father's legacy alive with new content that stays true to the core principles of a 45-year-old television show. But here's the thing about legacy. Something needs to end for a legacy to begin. The Muppets have been trading on the same goodwill that they erode with every new outing. And I understand the temptation. In researching this video, and maybe even for you in watching it, it's easy to be intrigued by their potential, but go watch them. Go watch them and come back and tell me if you think there's still juice there, or has their time come to pass. The wonder and the magic of the Muppet Show is that it's a fond memory that sustains us in adulthood, one that was born of youth and novelty. Can you really recreate that? And do you even really want to? Should the legacy of the Muppets be what it was or what it has become?